In this next video, I'm going to be talking about the 3 legal responsibilities that nonprofit boards have. These are all founded in U.S. case law, and particularly in what's called the Sibley Hospital case. Ultimately, boards are fiduciaries for nonprofit organizations. That means that they are supposed to look out for the best interest of those organizations and make decisions that will ensure that the nonprofit achieves its mission and is sustainable in the long term. What this also means is that ultimately nonprofit boards are the decision makers for nonprofit organizations, not the CEO, not the executive director. Since nonprofits have no ownership rights, there's no owner ultimately to be accountable to. The buck really stops with the nonprofit board. Ultimately, their fiduciary responsibility is guided by 3 principles. The first is what's called the duty of care. Duty of care means that nonprofit board members need to pay attention to the details. They should be aware of what's happening in terms of the organization. They should not be asleep at the wheel. This means that they need to operate in good faith. One should never join a nonprofit board and then fail to show up at meetings. That's not showing the duty of care. The second principle that's set out in terms of fiduciary responsibility is what's called the duty of loyalty. The duty of loyalty means that you need to avoid appearances of conflicts of interest and actual conflicts of interest. So nonprofit board members cannot participate or receive benefits from their decisions. The rule here is no private inurement, which means that they cannot create a deal so that their company or their spouse or their brother or sister-in-law or their friend receives a contract for the nonprofit without going through the due diligence of making sure that they are in fact the best company for the job. And they should not be involved in the voting for that contract. They need to recuse themselves from that particular vote. So, duty of care, duty of loyalty. Third one is duty of obedience. And this means that nonprofit board members are supposed to make sure that ultimately they are able to align their nonprofit with what the legal rules are for that organization. This means that they need to ensure that if the nonprofit makes enough money and revenues to be required to have an annual audit, that audit is completed and that the accountant's managerial letter is part of what they pay attention to as they realign what the organization is doing in its financial practices to make it so that they are following better general accounting principles. It also means that if you are in a particular area that is regulated, whether that is childcare or food services or providing shelter, that all of the requirements are met for those local and state level guidelines. So ultimately, board members are responsible for fulfilling these 3 duties. If a nonprofit has boards that does not fulfill these 3 duties, there's a lot of risks. There are risks to the nonprofit, and there are risks to individual board members who can be held individually responsible for their failure to meet these 3 duties. And they can be held responsible in a court of law. So those are the key principles of what a nonprofit board member is required to do according to U.S. case law.